And good Monday to you, everybody. Chris Landry here with ACC Football and Beyond for this hour as we're going to take you through the league and all the information going on around the league, and as well as the breakdowns. We'll continue our breakdowns with Notre Dame, Boston College, Wake Forest, Pitt, and Virginia Tech today. We're going to remember Bobby Bowden. I call it a celebration of life. It's certainly sad news to lose Coach Bowden. Give some stories and how he handled some things, my experiences with him. But, you know, when someone has touched as many people as he had and lives to the ripe old age of 91 in a very full life, I think we can call it a celebration. We'll miss him, but a celebration. So thoughts and prayers to all the kids. I know Tommy, Terry, and Jeff real well. Know Miss Ann a little bit. Thoughts and prayers to everyone in the family as we lose a legend. I want to remind you again, you're listening to ACC Football and Beyond. At the top of the hour, actually about 5 minutes after, we're going to have SEC Football and Beyond for you. If you're watching this live, hopefully you're watching it on Twitch TV, twitch.tv/Chris Landry Football. If you're listening to this in podcast form, you want to make sure that you check with us live and watch the show so that you can interact, ask questions as we do the show, and we will certainly address them. Follow us by clicking the heart button there. And certainly if you're watching this and you want a chance to listen to the podcast in podcast form, sign up for Landry Football's podcast channel. As again, we'll get you this show and the SEC show on Tuesdays. And check out the full schedule. Tomorrow we've got the Scouts Eye on College Football, the Big Ten show, and the Scouts Eye Pro Football show, all on twitch.tv. But I want to start, obviously, with the remembrance of Coach Bowden. What can be said that hasn't already been said? Just a great individual, a great man of faith, lived it, believed it, can tell you that he touched a lot of players that he obviously recruited and mentored. His style, his folksy style, and his homespun to the core religious beliefs won a lot of mamas over in living rooms, promising that their young man is not only going to get a good education, going to go to school, but I'm going to make sure your boy goes to church every Sunday, and there's nothing a mama wants to hear more than that. And he did it, and he lived it. He recruited players, some of them that were problems. And we had conversations several times. I worked a couple of his camps at Florida State back in the day and went on a few clinic circuits with him, coaching clinic circuits. And in between giving speeches at coaching clinics, you have a little downtime to talk. And I always would ask him how he did certain things. And he was always very open, always willing to help. And he always told me, because he had guys on his team that were what you would call problem children. And he always said that if you're going to recruit guys that have problems, don't run them off if they have problems. You know that going in. Now, there's some exceptions to that. Some you just got to move on from, as he used to say, and he did. Randy Moss was one of them, for example. And he didn't run off a lot of guys, but there's some that did. He embraced them. He loved them, and he cared for them, and but he understood the value of players, and he understood that, you know, he was going to get the most out of the player as a person and as a player. And I think that everyone that played for him looked at him as I think early on in his career as a fatherly figure, but as he got older, he became more of a grandfatherly figure. He was much more hands-on in that. Now, the latter part of his career, he wasn't very active on the field in coaching. He'd sit to the side. He'd go up in a little sitting area they had for him, and he'd take notes, and he'd take nap after practice, and after meetings before lunch, and have lunch with Ann, his wife, and come back for practice. He delegated a lot, but his presence was always felt. It was always big, and in his heyday, he was one of the really good teachers of wide receivers and really good teachers of the passing game. He was somebody that grew up around football. You've probably heard the story, but as a young kid, he was very sickly. He was, I think it was rheumatic fever or something, and he just was bedridden in his bed. And he listened to games, and he was a big war buff. And he actually loved Alabama, grew up in Alabama, and ended up, he wanted to go to Alabama and stay at Alabama, but that rules about kids getting married. And he married Miss Ann. He had when he went off, he had heard that Miss Ann was dating some other guy, and so he went back and he said, he told me, he said, I got to put a ring on the finger, and it's a different world. But as he grew up, he became a coach. He was an assistant at Florida State, among other places early on. And I think people remember him first, obviously, for being the head coach at West Virginia. And it's a little bit of an indication, isn't it, of the times that we're in now, where he was struggling early at West Virginia in building a program. In fact, just to put it in perspective, if it was in today's world or today's immediately win or you're going to get fired type, he probably would have never gotten the Florida State job because he would have never had enough success to stay at West Virginia. So in today's world, the approach, had it been that case back then, he would have never had enough success at West Virginia to keep the job. In fact, he was oh so close to getting fired at West Virginia a couple of times. Then he survived it, and then he, parlayed it into going back to Florida and going to Florida State. And the program was nothing at Florida State. There was no program, there was no facilities, there's no real stadium, just nothing there to really recruit other than we know what made Florida State in Miami, and I think Florida was first, but because of the ties to the SEC, but it was a population boom. So he was able to recruit, he was able to build it, and he did it by going on the road and playing everybody on the road. Of course, they didn't have much of a stadium, they didn't have a real home field advantage, so why not go on the road and play everybody? That's what they did. They'd play 8 games on the road. I mean, it was just anybody, anytime, anywhere. LSU, Nebraska, Michigan, you name it, they'd go play it. That's what they were. That's what they were. And then he built something to where you could have a place that you can play home and homes. And of course, was an independent, and I can remember when Florida State. I was good friends with Larry Jones, who was the head coach at Florida State before Bobby got there. Larry was with me at LSU. He was a assistant athletic director, and just wasn't much there. It was an all-girls school for a long time, and you had some good players that went through there. Fred Blitnikoff went there, and a number of others, but it wasn't a program. It wasn't a real program to speak of, as we're mentioning. He built it. He built it into not a good program. He built it into an elite program. I mean, 14 straight years, I believe it was, in the top 5, or 16, something ridiculous. It was dominant. Went from independent, and then they started looking at getting into a conference. And there was an opportunity to get in the SEC. Coach Biden told me, he said, I don't want to go in the SEC. I mean, why would I want to do that? I can go in the ACC and dominate that league. At that time, nobody was doing anything in the ACC. Steve Spurrier had won a conference title at Duke, and I mean, Clemson had a lot of old history and had some fairly recent history with Danny Ford, but that program had slipped due to probation. And that was the only truly football school. You had old football schools like North Carolina and Duke used to be old football schools in the old Southern League, but it was basketball league and it was a small league and there wasn't a real football team. Well, then he went in the ACC. I think he said there were some folks that was interested in going in the SEC within the administration, but Coach Bowden obviously was the father of the program and built it, and obviously they went forever. I still can remember that Thursday night game in Charlottesville, Virginia was the first game that Florida State lost. I mean, it was a few years before they lost an ACC game. To say they dominated was to put this in perspective, it was a bigger domination than what Clemson's doing right now. That's how dominant it was. There wasn't close games or anything. Tons of players, tons of top 5 recruiting classes, ton of top 5 teams, countless games against Miami that were classic. Many of them in the early part of the year that would usually define who could be in the hunt for a title or not. And I always thought a couple of things that he told me that he figured out what a big game was. So what's that, Coach? He said the big game is the game you don't win. He said because when you win a game, well, that's not a big game. You lose a game, well, you can't win the big game. And that was his mantra. He couldn't win the big game. Couldn't beat Miami. Okay, wide right and all that stuff. Couldn't win the big game until he could. And it's kind of, we've heard that before. He ironically won one against Tom Osborne, who was another guy that couldn't win the big game until he did. It's a different world, and obviously today well, this guy chokes. He can't do this. He can't do that. It just makes you wonder. And a lot of people look back and think, when you think of all the success, it feels like they won about 4 national titles. They won 2. It wasn't in a playoff era. It was in a different era. And getting by Miami was the key and couldn't do it sometimes. And, so there we go. But a dominant program nonetheless. One of the things he said, and I can't remember that he was specifically talking about one individual player, but it was one of his things that he quipped in saying, talking about a player, and I think he was saying this in a clinic setting about a generic player, and I don't, again, this is not his style because he wouldn't do this, but he was talking about a player, generic player. Man, he doesn't know the meaning of the word quit. Of course, I looked at his report card, and I don't think he knows the meaning of too many words. So that was kind of his way of saying things. He had a very funny way about him. He was just a really, really great person. So we had a game one time when I was coaching at LSU. And fairly late in the game on our sidelines, it was in Doak Campbell, and there was a pretty big brouhaha, players getting into it and all that. And after the game, he sought me out and he apologized for the late game, as if he needed to apologize for ridiculous. Of course he didn't. That's where he was. So just a great individual. Broke the mold, no question, and certainly we'll miss him. Some news around tough transition. We'll just do it quickly. In North Carolina, this freshman offensive lineman A.J. Beatty, someone that really wasn't going to factor into their 2-deep rotation this year, has decided to transfer. We've got more news around the country. A lot of things going on recruiting and practice-wise with all the practices starting this weekend. Check it out over at LandryFootball.com for all the latest information. All right, let's get into some of the breakdowns. I want to get into Notre Dame. Let's talk about them. And I want to mention first about where kind of the program is in terms of Brian Kelly and where they've been as a program for a while. And I think he's very underappreciated. I think there's a misunderstanding of what the program is, what it has been, what it can be. He has developed, in my opinion, an elite program, despite recruiting limitations. They have built elite players at the line of scrimmage and extremely well coached. They lack outside skill players on offense, enough of them. They have to play elite skill in the playoffs. So that's the missing piece of the puzzle that limits them once they get to the playoffs. But the offense is built around the run game and protecting the football. The defense has multiple fronts. They'll probably play more multiple defensive fronts now under Marcus Freeman than they did under Clark Lee and Mike Elko. They've got some elite players such as Kyle Hamilton, Michael Mayer, Kyron Williams at running back. They have to rebuild most of their offensive line and their defensive front pressure. I don't know that they have a roster that looks playoff caliber this year. But I think when you think historically Notre Dame, well, they're overrated, they're this, they're that. They don't recruit the same players that you're going to see the Clemsons and the Alabamas and the Georgias recruit. You have to take calculus as a freshman at Notre Dame. You got to live on campus. I mean, there's some restrictions. You do not have control of your discipline of your football program, the university disciplines. So there's some things that are done that are uniquely Notre Dame. Now, in the past, mainly when Lou Holtz got the job, they loosened up some of the academic restrictions. And that didn't work all that well. It did on the field. It got them a national championship. But it hadn't been the same. And they don't have the exception. Oh, they have problems. They have the problems like everybody else. But it's handled differently. And the thing about it is you go back to when they played Alabama in 2012. They were dominated by Alabama in the trenches. They played Alabama this past year. They didn't get dominated by Alabama in the trenches now. They played pretty well in the trenches. They just don't have the explosive skill that is the difference there. So that's kind of an overview in what I think is, in my view, a program that's a lot better than people give them credit for. Look, I think that they're more like what a Stanford does in some of the restrictions there. And they can recruit nationally, but they have to meet certain academic requirements and getting enough skill. That's why I think the fact that they've been good enough to go unbeaten in that schedule is a lot more challenging than you think. To have to play not in a conference where you play a lot. If you play in the Big 12, you know what you're going to face. You play in the Big 10 West, you're going to play something completely different, but you know what you're going to face. When you're in Notre Dame, you're playing spread 1 week, you're playing pro set power 1 week, you're playing option 1 week, you're all over the place. It's a very difficult schedule, and I don't think people appreciate what they do well enough. And they think, I'm tired of seeing them in the playoffs because they can't win. Well, somebody needs to beat them out. I get it. I thought they were a little bit better than A&M last year. Thought they deserved to get in. But I understand the criticism. We want to see somebody else. Well, wanting to see somebody else is one thing. Somebody else being better is, quite frankly, different. So that's a look at Notre Dame. And I think that they're a team that can be very good this year. But I don't think they're going to be quite playoff good this season. Want to go to Boston College. Very intriguing program. Next up on the breakdown list. And one thing that Jeff Hafley's doing with that program is recruiting nationally with the Catholic schools. It's elite academics. They have an NFL pipeline, particularly on the offensive line, but at other positions too. They had their best recruiting class in 10 years this year. the quarterback, Phil Jurkovec. Speaking of Notre Dame, transferred from Notre Dame. Not only good, but it's certainly having kind of a mobilizing, approach in an effect into their view of the transfer portal and getting other people interested in the transfer portal. To get 4- and 5-star players, BC is not going to be able to recruit them. So what they're looking is for the right type of guy that's going to fit in their locker room, that are 4- and 5-star guys that will go to Ohio State, where Jeff was before, or someplace else, and get those 4- and 5-star guys to transfer in if they don't quite make it or things don't go quite as well as their other place. They're one of the best, pass protection units. They're one of the best in the ACC in terms of this season at quarterback, wide receiver, offensive line. The running game was inconsistent last year. It's got to improve. The red zone offense must get better, no question. The defense is lacking in talent. That concerns me. But they're running better scheme, and I think they're emphasizing speed over size on defense. And, we're starting to struggle to defend the spread and to deal with the type of quarterbacks that they face. When they can improve the talent level on defense, they're going to have to implement their scheme a little bit better and be able to make it work. But, when you look at the team, it's got some talent. I mean, there's no question that they have some talent on that team that can play. The quarterback's good. I think that they've got, with Frank Cignetti, an improved looking offense that can work the run game and work play action. I think they've got really good receivers led by Zay Flowers. I think they've got really 3 good receivers that can play. I think the question mark will be about the running game on offense. I think the secondary is loaded on defense, but I worry about the defensive front. So they're looking to kind of take that step from a team that they have, believe it or not, higher expectations than you might think. They're very, very regimented in how they do it. And I think that the quarterback's a game changer and could be a difference maker. They're going to miss Hunter Long, who's with the Dolphins and actually early injury in their camp. So anyway, I think that this is it's a team in a program that has a chance to start to get a little bit better as time goes along. But it really is going to come down to how well they're able to recruit. I want to go next to Wake Forest, another program that's a developmental program. And when I look at them, one of the things that intrigues me about them is that they're a very good mid-level developmental program. There's no smaller student population base amongst a Power 5 team than Wake Forest. There's nothing flashy about what they do. The quarterback makes good decisions in their offense. They have good wide receivers. They develop players well on the offensive line. They like players on their defense. Their poor linebacking group in particular. They're replacing the best pass rusher in Boogie Basham. They attack the middle of the field well. The thing that jumps out at me on tape with Wake is how they work their slot receivers and tight ends in the RPO game. And the key for them to being better than just average or okay is getting more depth. That's the biggest problem that they have. They lack playmakers on defense. They usually do all the little things well, but they can't overtake many games in terms of explosiveness. It's kind of a sleepy program that stays behind the scenes, and they've always been that way. Jim Grobe, when it'd been good. Jim Grobe And I think Dave Clawson does the same thing. The new offensive coordinator, Warren Ruggiero, I've known, and he's I think he does a good job with the RPOs. And I say you knew he's been there for a little bit. They do a really good job, as I mentioned, getting the tight ends and the slots in. And the reason is those are real short, angular routes. And what they do with the mesh point is they have the quarterback work the mesh point a little bit longer to suck those linebackers in, and they'll hit the crossers on top of them. Or if the linebacker doesn't commit, they'll just hand it off. And they're pretty effective with it. They run a lot out of 11 personnel, but they'll mix in some jumbo packages. The offense is fast tempo. They want to get 85, 95 snaps a game if they can. But then if they're not real effective, it affects their already thin defense. They run a 4-2-5 under Lyle Hemphill. That is a defense that just doesn't have the overall personnel to match up. And so the problem is how do you deal with that tempo with a defense that's not as good? So depth is the biggest issue. So when they have injuries, and everybody does, it affects them a little bit more. If it's key injuries, then it can get really, really bad. Sam Hartman is a very functional quarterback, but he's got to work from a clean pocket. And I think he'll do a good job if they're able to give him that. Brandon Chapman and Blake Whiteheart are really good blockers at the tight end position and can get open down the seam. That defense has been poor for 6 years now. But last year they were able to create some turnovers. I don't like the linebacker play. I think the secondary is just too banged up and not deep enough. They allowed a lot of points. I do think the interior of the defensive line with Miles Fox can be pretty good. The Suleiman Kamara and the Tyler Williams kid can play. But again, as I mentioned, the linebacking group I'm concerned about. Samaja Jr. struggled with injuries. Luke Masterson, Trevon Reed, A.J. Williams. I need to see more from them. I think that Nick Anderson can play in the secondary. He's a former walk-on there. Nasir Green can be a really good player. But it's a program that's never going to have a lot of success because of the fact that it's such a small school. And it's difficult to recruit to. I've had coaches that have worked there that used to pull a trick on recruits. They would come in and they would bring kids to one of the neighboring campuses like Duke or somewhere. It was so bad there. So that's a look at Wake Forest, and I don't expect a whole lot from them this year in terms of improvement. But they always are tough. They're always tough to try to get in and create some issues. Next up, I want to talk a little bit about the Pitt Panthers and take a look. And I appreciate Jig's dad joining us there today, and we'll get to his questions in a bit. When I look at Pitt, it's a program that frustrates me in that they don't have a real strong identity, or at least an identity that I think would be a good fit for them. They seem to have stabilized their defense. They develop well on their defensive line. They usually play well in the secondary, but it's a floating identity on offense. You don't know what they're going to be. They're inconsistent in that they can surprise you and beat you and then lose to anyone because they underachieve. They lack playmakers. The personnel is a better fit in the run game with play-action concepts. But when they brought in Mark Whipple to run the offense, he's a spread pass game guy, and I don't think they have the personnel to run it. Now, Kenny Pickett's a very underrated quarterback, but I don't like the pass game concepts. They're not that good. Their offensive again, lacks identity. And, Paul Chryst is left, when he left to go back to Wisconsin, he left them a big offensive line and a good running game, but they don't identify with that anymore. So this program should be the Wisconsin or the Iowa of the ACC. And they're not that. And the Coastal's very mediocre. It is, and look, they've won the Coastal once, but everybody's won the Coastal at least once. And it's not because they've done a good job, it's because no one's been very good. And when it's wide open because no one's very good, it's more about what somebody can't do than what they can do. So I think that's the thing that frustrates me about that program. I think that there's enough talent in their area to where I think they're capable of creating their own identity to be real physical. They're not going to recruit as good as Miami and not going to recruit as North Carolina. But, you can recruit better than they have. And I think they've done okay. I just think they can do better. And recruit to the strength, which is build that run game. If you're going to have a good defense, build towards that. Then build towards that and work the running game to work. So can you get to double-digit wins? You got a good quarterback that's a fifth-year quarterback, an aggressive defense. You're a natural leader at quarterback. You got fix the running game. Vincent Davis thought he did a good job against Georgia Tech in the latter part of the year. Take some pressure off of Pickett. Need more out of Davis. And at receiver, Jordan Addison is a really good player. I thought he was one of the best freshman receivers in the country. He's a really good route runner. He's got some speed. But they need more guys that can get open. I do like Jimmy Morrissey at center. I like the tackles, Carter Warren and Gabe Huey. But, it's really about what they can do in terms of getting explosive plays because they play too many close games, and if they don't play that fine line of clean football at all times, they're going to have an issue. The backbone of their teams have been the defense. They've ranked high in sacks per game and tackles for losses. They do a really good job there. They'll miss Patrick Jones and Rashad Weaver, but Deslin Alexander is a really good player. Devin Danielson's a really good player. Keyshawn Camp and the Cansey kid, Kalijah Cansey, is really good. I think the linebackers should be the strength with Cam Bright and Phil Campbell and Savasi Dennis. Chase Pine's a good player. Wendell Davis, they've got some good depth there. In the secondary, it's a bit in transition. They'll lose DeMar Hamlin. They're going to miss him, and Paris Ford. You've got some experience on the corner with A.J. Woods and Marquise Williams, Rashad Battle and Damari Mathis. Junior Eric Hallett is another guy to watch. So I think this is a team that's got a chance to be a little bit better because of the quarterback position. They're recruiting-wise rank like a top 25, which is not bad, in the top 6 in the ACC. I'm curious to see if Rodney Hammond can get anything out of him, and Elliott Donald, who's related to Aaron Donald, if he can become the type of player that they hope he can become. But this is a program, again, that I think has maybe not the potential to be what old Pitt used to be, but in the days of Jackie Sherrill and when Jackie was an assistant for Johnny Majors. But this is a program in the Coastal that could be making more noise than they are. So that's a look at the Pitt Panthers. Want to now get into Virginia Tech, speaking of programs that can be frustrating and difficult to understand and difficult to figure out. Virginia Tech, I want to start big picture that the recruiting, it's a chicken-egg thing because on the field affects your recruiting, no doubt. But big picture recruiting is hurt to set this program back. Miami and North Carolina have left them in the dust. Pitt, West Virginia, Georgia Tech, they identify their styles in recruiting better. They've tried to live off the transfer portal, and you must recruit and develop, and then they add portal guys to the mix. Their frontline guys can compete pretty well, but the depth is the result of their recruiting struggles. They've lost ground in the D.C. area, the DMV area, the whole Virginia area. Fuente hasn't done much in developing a quarterback, which is his strength. It's what he did at TCU for Gary Patterson and had them, some people thought, worthy of making the playoffs that year, BCS that year. Look, I mean, I think those are things that you look at and you say, why haven't, at this stage, they haven't gotten to that point. Defensively, they appeal to be a basket case. They're trying to do too much. They're jumping in and out of philosophies, trying to marry up multiple schemes. They're tough to watch. They may have lost more than the defensive coordinator when Bud Foster left. And look, they were struggling late in Bud Foster's tenure there. But it's become worse because they're trying to do some of the high-pressure stuff that Bud ran. Then they're trying to back off to some of the stuff. It's just a frustrating look. It looks a confused look that hasn't worked all that well. You know, you look at the Coastal, and you think it's North Carolina and then it's Miami, and that's kind of how I see it. And good luck trying to figure it out from there. I mean, we just talked about Virginia Tech, Pitt. I think you throw Georgia Tech in there, Virginia. I mean, why not throw them in a mix and who knows? I would put Duke at the bottom. We've talked about Clemson and NC State already. We talked about Wake today, and I think they probably are in that group near the bottom with Syracuse and Louisville. We'll see. BC, could they finish third in the Atlantic? I'm not sure. I think that is absolutely possible. So we'll see how that plays out. Let's get to a couple of mailbag questions here. Jig's dad, big Syracuse fan. Good to have you back, man. Do you agree with the philosophy that Syracuse to try to use the Dome to a recruiting advantage by a fast-paced offense like Dino runs, or have more of a play-action passing run identity for being a Northeast school? Well, I think that, first of all, I think there are a couple of ways you can look at that. I do think, you have the Dome, right? So you have to play to that. They're not changing that, and that's the on-campus Dome, and going to sell that. I think you can sell that. First of all, that's what you get with Dino Babers. Dino comes from the Art Brow School, so that's what he's going to be. So as long as he's going to be there, that's what's going to be their mantra. I think you're looking at, for example, let's take programs. We just talked about Wake. They run a lot of RPL stuff. Jeff Hafley wants to do that at BC. So, yeah, you can do that, and I think a lot of the programs are doing that. I think indoors you can do that, but you've got to go find players. Look, whatever you do, you have to find and develop players. And the bottom line is they haven't recruited very well. They've recruited, and I'll get to the breakdown a little bit more, but when I get to them, and that'll be next week more than likely. I think we'll get to the remainder of them. They're not recruiting well. And if you don't recruit well, it matters not what's – it certainly – you have to have your style and your mission. But they're not recruiting well for any style. I think you can recruit some speed. I think you can recruit to the Dome, and that's probably what I would do. I don't know that they're going to be able to, because they don't play a Northeast brand, so to speak. You don't do that unless you're able to get the big physical guys and run power and play great defense. I think their best chance is probably to get a quarterback that's a dual threat guy that can be a factor in the run game, some backs that can play and run well in space, some speed at receiver, play fast on defense, and try to work tempo. I mean, look, that's what Dino's going to do. Now, if you're thinking beyond Dino, I mean, the biggest thing is you got to recruit well. Get somebody that can recruit, and I do think the style could be successful in any way you want to go. For them indoors, I think they can find some skill, may have to go a little bit out of their area, but I think they can do it. The biggest thing is that they don't recruit well and they don't develop well. There's not enough there, and that's why when I look at them, I mean, it's the most unimpressive program in the league right now. I mean, Duke is Duke. Cuts had success. We know what they are. Wake gets more out of their program. Louisville has, although not very good. Broncos doing a better job at Virginia. Georgia Tech's in a reclamation project, but better and in better position. Pitt, I just went over Virginia Tech's not doing good, but they all are doing a better job recruiting and developing than Syracuse. I mean, with what their resources are. Syracuse is a good school. They've got old tradition. Young kids don't know it. You've got to sell them on the dome. You got to sell them on speed. I think you can sell that. I think if you're selling big power, I don't know that works quite as good. I think if you're Pitt, you can probably do that. It maybe fits more of your style. So I would probably be more inclined with going with that. But it depends on who you hire. I think the biggest thing is you've got to get somebody in there that can sell that program and recruit that program, and you're going to have to upcoach them a little bit. And right now, what I see is a program that doesn't develop very well. And I know people say, well, man, look at Dino a couple of years ago. He did this. I got it, and it can happen. That's an indication that when it all comes together, it can happen. But look what's happened since. Look at their inability to recruit and build off that very successful season. That's what you have to do. You had that season. Yeah, it was a little flash in the pan and all things came together. It happens. You got to recruit. Not recruit at a top 10 level nationally, but you got to recruit better than near the bottom of the ACC when you're having that success. They haven't been able to do that. And if you can't do that, you're not – you combine that with their inability to coach at a level that maybe some other folks can, milk 3 or 4 wins out of a season. They're not like Northwestern, who just in the Big Ten that just does a good job. They're physical, they're tough, they play the style in the Big Ten, and they win a lot of close games. Duke's not very good, but they're able to times find the right quarterback, and they can get enough out of the passing game, and they might be able to surprise and beat people. Syracuse hasn't really found that identity. So I would like to see them find an identity, and I'd like to see them to recruit and develop better, but they have not been able to do that. Hey, folks, appreciate you. We've got a lot of other national news going on around the world of college football today. Some SEC news. We're going to get to some of that coming up on the top of the hour with SEC football and beyond with myself and Dan Matthews. Some position moves, some player moves in the early part of training camps as we're getting ready for the season. Also, some NFL news as well. On LandryFootball.com, which is going on in training camps. Another injury for Hunter Henry. We'll update on how severe that is. We'll get to that as well. Reminder that if you're listening to this in podcast form, you can check us out live on twitch.tv/Chris Landry Football and go into the chat room and communicate with us, ask us any questions. We will appreciate you joining us and taking part in the show. If you are just catching this in the podcast, check us out on Landry Football Podcast channel. Sign up for that, and you'll get notification on all of our shows that we'll do. And that, for the podcast part, is going to be this show, the SEC show. Tomorrow, we're going to have Scout's Eye on College Football at 3 p.m. Central, a national look at college football. At 4 p.m. Central, Big Ten football and beyond. And then we're going to have Scout's Eye on Pro Football at 5 p.m. Central. So a triple header Tuesday and triple header Wednesday as well. But mark your calendar tomorrow to join us for some more football. Check us out over at LandryFootball.com. Take advantage of the football season sale today. Thanks, Jig's Dad, for your questions and your thoughts inside the chat room today. talk to you top of the hour for SEC Football and Beyond. So long, everybody. Talk to you next time.